Well, we teased everybody at the top of the program that if you like the classic wrestling, folks, we're going to have some for you today. Plenty of classic wrestling going all the way back because there is a new book out that, if it's not my favorite professional wrestling book I've ever read, it's close to it. And Brian, you felt the same way. And naturally, with both of us being like minded, we had to hunt down the author and grill him extensively for the Cult of Cornette audience.
That is indeed right, and that is also indeed a transition to me over here. And I'll let everyone know that is what we did. We spoke with Jon Langmead, the author of the brand new book, Ballyhoo. And I moved the book into the other room, so I don't remember the con artist, real life criminals, scallywags, and frauds.
Scallywags and reprobates and Monty Banks.
Well, you will hear the full title of it, and of course, if you listen to the show, we will have a link to buy it on Twitter, but there have been a lot of stories written over the years in real time, and then, of course, in various books about the characters that helped found American pro wrestling, or pro wrestling as we call it. It's not always easily digestible, and a lot of people know the names, and they really don't know exactly what anyone did or how it happened. I think this book, Jim, did a better job than anything else before it at making it easy to understand the origins of wrestling history.
I agree.
Well, let's see. I'm sure Jon Langmead's going to agree too, but let's go now to the conversation. The author of Ballyhoo, Jon Langmead.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, the time has come here on The Experience. We're going to go to school. We're going to go to the College of Wrestling Knowledge because we have the author of what I dare say may be my favorite book ever written on professional wrestling, because it's the Fall Guys written in modern language, ladies and gentlemen. Ballyhoo, the roughhousers, con artists, and wild men who invented professional wrestling by Jon Langmead. It is a book on not only the origin of the wrestling business that we have all come to love at some stage or another, but some of the most fascinating characters to exist in American sports or entertainment history. And we welcome him to talk about all of these people and so many more. Jon Langmead. Jon, thank you for being here.
Thank you. It is an incredible honor, and I am so happy to be talking with you. So thanks for having me.
When I read this book, when it was over with, or when I finished it, I was pissed because there wasn't any more, because I wanted more. I read like an idiot. I read the notes in the back, right? This is so well researched. You've got 40 pages of notes, chapter by chapter in the back, and they're fascinating. But let me ask you this question, because I've talked to Tim Hornbaker, who's done those incredible history books, and we've talked to Brian Solomon, who's part of our little extended family here. And I say the same thing, the research, not only the job of research, but the patience that you had to have to undergo it. But in this case, it is so, I mean, this book pops these people to life in your mind like you're reading a book on P.T. Barnum or you're reading a book on Florence Ziegfeld. But was it always your intention to, even though they're all here, the big hits, the Toots Monts, the Strangler Lewises, was it your intention going in to focus on Jack Curley, or did that evolve as you started to learn more? Because he may be the most fascinating one of the bunch.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes. Thank you. Yes. So it wasn't my intention going in. My intention going in was just like, I think like everybody who researches this, Tim, Brian, all the guys I mentioned in the book, like, I think we're just interested in that era. Like, I wanted to know more. And then when the idea of kind of writing a book kind of was coming along, I was like, how could I structure this? Because I wanted to. I appreciate what you said. Like, I mean, that was my goal, right? Was to like, how do I hook people with this? And not only wrestling people, but people that might not have any interest in wrestling, who might just have a general interest. Like, how do I make this a great story for people? Over time, I was kind of like, I had to have a character. I had to have somebody I could kind of put this on. And that name, Jack Curley, just came up over and over. Like, anytime you look up wrestling from this era, it's pretty rare that you're not going to come across Jack Curley's name in one way or another. So he just seemed like the perfect character. And it kind of was like good for me, maybe bad for him. Like his life just aligned perfectly with like the era that I was personally interested in. Like, you know, that turn of the century right up through, if people haven't read the book, the 1937, the trial that happens in Columbus, Ohio, where wrestling is effectively put on trial in, like, you know, the national courts. Like he's there everywhere you go. Jack Curley is there. He's at Gotch Hackenschmidt. He's Jim Melendez, you know, working with Jim Melendez. He works with Strangler Lewis. He's at the trial. He's everywhere. So
the Jack Johnson fight,
like, perfect. The Jack
Johnson fight. I mean, this is
exactly.
a guy who may very well, if things had gone differently, been one of the great boxing promoters that you would be writing a book on now, but he was more suited and happenstance took him to wrestling. But this is like like you said, a turn of the century, both late 1800s, early 1900s, history lesson on some of the most famous incidents in American history. And this guy is popping up in the middle of it and goes on to basically set the blueprint for how to promote professional wrestling that evolved in one way or another for the next 100 years.
I agree with that completely. I mean, and that was what I was so interested in, is I think by like, and you can please tell me if you feel differently, but like by the 1920s, I kind of feel like, and especially the 1930s, no doubt, like wrestling matches were pretty much set. Like, I don't know that they changed all that much up and through. I mean, I think by the 90s and the 2000s, things had changed, but like through the early 80s, I think you could, obviously matches were longer. Guys didn't jump off the top rope. Things were different in that respect. But I think the idea of the template had basically been set by then. And I think that Curley had a gigantic hand in making that happen. But yeah, I was just so interested in that era. I was so interested in the people. I mean, as I was kind of researching this and working on it, like those guys, Curley, Londas, Gus Sonnenberg, like they felt very alive to me. And I just wanted to really, I hope that comes across for people, because that was really my goal, was how to make these guys feel as alive as any wrestler today.
Well, you know, that's the thing, is that I mentioned, you know, they pop out at you because, you know, I'm a big reader, always have been. And I love, you know, biographies of famous people that were in any genre or form of, you know, endeavor that I'm kind of interested about. And, you know, these people are such unique, as Mama Cornette used to say, boy, what characters they are. They're such unique people that they could be. This doesn't have to be a book about wrestling. It is, because that was their line of work. But the stories, the way they did things, the way that they conducted themselves, the peculiarity, the Jack Feffers of, I mean, how do you can't write that, right? It has to be real, and you report on it. You can't make these things up. And I think it's fascinating Americana is what I'm saying.
Well, what I wanted to do, I mean, I appreciate that. What I wanted to do was I really wanted to focus on, like, put it in their terms on us. How are fans thinking about wrestling? How are the promoters thinking? And that's why I think I leaned so heavily on trying to quote them directly. And, you know, and it was, as you go, like, as you look at the newspapers from that era, these guys are in there a lot. They're interviewed. The reporters are quoting them. So it wasn't a huge chore necessarily to find quotes that I could kind of use throughout the book, but I wanted to make it feel very much from that era and not take a perspective of like looking back at it and judging it, or, you know what I mean? So I really tried hard on that. And I'll say, to your point, like the thing for me that really, when this clicked for me and I kind of felt like I knew what what the story was, for me personally, like I play music on the side, I play drums for a bunch of different bands. I've, you know, been in touring bands. I kind of have a sense of what that life is like. Like, that's what these guys felt like to me. Like, they were entertainers on the road, athletes, entertainers on the road, living that life, trying to make a living as traveling entertainers, with all the good and the bad that comes from that life. You know, going to different towns, trying to get people to show up, buy a ticket to come see them perform. And once I kind of had a sense of them in that respect, that just, the story just kind of went from there.
Well, then the analogy is kind of like, for the average wrestlers, they were, like you said, going from town to town, traveling entertainers. For the bigger wrestlers, they were the guys that were on the top of the bill in vaudeville, which was the number one live entertainment form in the country at the time, except the main event guys, the Strangler Lewises and et cetera. They were on Broadway. They were making the big money.
Right.
And you mentioned the newspapers, and we'll go back to that because that's what even before radio, much less before television, that was the way that you promoted the fact that anything was going to happen. If you were trying to draw a crowd, trying to make people aware of something, everybody read the newspaper. And as a result, that's what any wrestling or sports promoter or show promoter, they wanted to put the posters up around town. They wanted to get in the newspaper. And if they had to, as you report in some cases, I believe in the book, they would pay to get, some publicity. There were all kinds of deals going on where in the old days, before radio, before television, before there was any other way to do it, these sports writers for boxing promoters, wrestling promoters, if you were on the New York Daily News sports desk, you could make some better money from the people you were writing about than the stuff you were writing, the company you were writing for. But the point is, that's where I was going with that, is since they were in the newspapers constantly, and the main event world title wrestling matches were reported like the World Boxing Championship. And these guys were celebrities when you couldn't, make a dime playing football. And so I guess what I'm asking you is, when you go back to that era, do you think that was the time when wrestling was most mainstream in this country, the pioneer days from the early 1900s through the days of Londos, when everybody was exposed to them? But every fan says that when wrestling goes through a hot period, oh, wrestling's hotter than it's ever been. No, it's only hotter than it's ever been since you've been alive, right? But
I think totally.
Were these guys in from the 1900s to the 1930s as professional wrestlers? Were they the biggest stars to the public at large that they have ever been since the invention of the business?
I would say I think so. So everything you said, I completely agree with. So these guys were sports stars, and I think what's cool, not to jump all around, but people have this kind of thought that like somehow everybody took wrestling, everybody bought wrestling hook, line, and sinker. They all thought it was real. Jack Feffer exposed it, that ruined the business, right? Like none of that's really true. Like sports writers covered wrestling. You can go to a newspaper and you can pick any day from 1920 or whatever. You're going to find articles about professional wrestling. You can look at the Joe Stecker Earl Caddick match that happened in 1920 in Madison Square Garden. The New York Times had they practically dedicated a whole page to writing about that match. They took it seriously to a certain degree. I think everybody had a healthy degree of skepticism about professional wrestling, and there were plenty of matches, and there's plenty of examples where that match was a put on, that match was fake, that match was legitimate. There was some kind of I think people, there was
chicanery,
but chicanery is a good word for it. But what you see that's really interesting is not just the New York Times. By the time of Jim Lundis, he's in the New Yorker, he's in Vanity Fair, he's in these gigantic public mainstream magazines that are covering him with a certain degree of seriousness. It really isn't until the 1940s, 1950s. And I think you and I actually may have spoken about this in the past, that wrestling goes out of nobody writes about wrestling anymore by the time you're in the 1960s. It's only covered in certain newspapers in certain towns, but the more mainstream area publications rarely write about it. But back then they were all covering them like major sports heroes. Frank Gosch was probably the most famous athlete in the country.
Yeah, because he was an individual rather than a part of a team or a racehorse, because horse racing was even bigger back then. But you mentioned the exposés and et cetera, and you can go back into the early 1900s and you'll see sports writers, and you could tell who was getting paid. Some were glowing and some were talking about it, but holding their nose, right? But there was always the skepticism and the speculation. Is it or isn't it? That's why the question persisted for so many years. Curiosity over what was going on fed a lot of that. When in New York, and Brian and I have covered, that whole era on this show often. when Feffer went out of his way to find somebody who also wanted to go out of his way to just blister wrestling, it killed it in New York. Not even necessarily the people that they confirmed that the suspicions, that was bad enough, but they blistered it. We've talked about it for the next 15 years in any of the English speaking media in New York. Wrestling was hooted at. That's why that Vince Sr. and the precursors had such success with Rocca or Bruno, the ethnic hero with that population, because the sports writers in New York were pissing on the business. But you find that in different places around the country through the years, though. But until I'm going to sum this up, until we, as a wrestling industry, the promoters and the wrestlers, threw our hands up and said, "Fuck it, you've been right all along. Everything's bullshit." That's when the speculation ended, and that's when the interest ended, and that's when a lot of interest ended. Well, the con man with the shell game, you can say, "Hey, that guy on the corner, don't play that shell game with him. He's fucking crooked, but I can beat him." But if the con man playing the shell game tells you, "I'm crooked, I'm going to fuck you," well, okay.
I think people don't like to do. I think what happened, and I agree with everything you're saying. I think people felt like suckers. I think that they felt. I think
Yes.
that happened in the end of the 1930s, early 1940s. Is people felt like they were being laughed at a little bit by everybody. The promoters thought they were suckers. The athletes thought they were suckers, and they kind of felt foolish. And then I think that the sports writers and the newspapers really added to that. So I think that really killed it in a lot, because people didn't want to feel that way. They didn't want to go and feel like they were being made fun of by the people they were paying money to go see necessarily. So I think, but what I think is so interesting about that, and you totally hit the nail on the head, I think, is that isn't it? People played with that a lot, I think, and the promoters played with that a lot. And I think that's something that I think people don't really appreciate, this idea that if they think everybody took it completely seriously back then, because I think the promoters knew early on part of the appeal of wrestling was kind of almost this like postmodern thing where it was like playing around with that. Like, was that real or was that not? People loved, part of the appeal of going to a wrestling match was seeing if you could spot when it was fake and when it wasn't. And that's absolutely, that's talked about plenty in the media from the 1930s. The part of it was seeing if you could see through the match.
The promoters would say, "Well, if you think this, come and see for yourself."
That's exactly, it had like that Barnum-esque kind of thing for it, right? Are you smart enough to kind of spot the fake? For sure.
Well, and also with the early years, the very early years of the pro game, a lot of money was made on gambling, betting. And that's why they had those 5-hour extravaganza. Oh, I bet he's going to get him in the next 10 minutes. Oh, you think so? That type of thing, because there were really no sports arenas to speak of in this country in those days. And for the boxing championship fights, they had to make their own goddamn wooden outdoor arenas and fields to hold people. And so they had to keep, because this was criminal activity, right? When you're fixing betting and all that stuff. And they got run out of more than one town as a result of it. But later on, when it became just as lucrative, if not more so, for the promoters and the wrestlers to actually just sell tickets to watch what we do, and gambling, optional, tip optional, whatever, then it really became bigger to where you had, and this is what I wanted to speak to you about. You talk about the newspaper coverage. You had Jim Londos, or you had the major name, Pickett, Lewis, Schickat, whatever, putting 30,000 people in the rudimentary baseball stadiums of the day when there were no interstates, there was no commercial air travel to speak of, and in the middle of the Depression. And they would get that many people to come and see what the fuck they were going to do. It's a marvel that you can motivate that many people, even in those days, under those conditions, to come out. And as a result, I think that you can make a case that those guys were the most at the top were the most compensated athletes of any kind in the world, judging for inflation, maybe still in the wrestling business today.
I mean, I think you're probably right. I mean, if you look at, so by the time of wrestling kind of goes through the doldrums a little bit in the 1920s in certain areas, not in all areas. But by the end, when you get Gus Sonnenberg kind of reignites the fire a little bit, you can see selling out, the Boston arena week after week. That's what's amazing to me, is they would sell out some of these places every week. So it was like what you see that like in the Mid-South Coliseum, right? Like when they were like selling out for whatever, 10 years in a row, but they were doing that in the early 1930s, late 1920s. And you get
no TV, very little radio.
No. And what's one kind of a story that kind of highlights that is the Dan O'Mahony match in Boston when he wrestled. Now I'm not going to forget now I'm going to completely blank on the name, but Jim Braddock had won he was boxing's heavyweight champion for a period in 1934. I think he won the championship, but the week after he wins the heavyweight championship, he goes to referee a Dan O'Mahony match in Boston, and Dan O'Mahony outdraws the Jim Braddock heavyweight championship match for Jim Braddock. Right. So, I mean, I think that is, if anything illustrates that, is that boxing at certain points could actually wrestling could actually outdraw boxing, heavyweight boxing, which was the major sport of the 1920s. Jim Londas practically sold out Yankee Stadium for a match with Ray Steele at the height of his popularity. I mean, these guys were drawing massive crowds week after week after week. It wasn't a one-off. It was not a one-off phenomenon. This was happening all over the country during that period.
Well, and this was before, obviously, the territories were formed per se, and the major promoters would hook up with anybody anywhere to do something to make money. And so it was a situation where Londos didn't have to work 7 nights a week. He could take these big matches. He drew wherever he went. He could pick his spots in most cases. And again, the money adjusted for today's inflation rate, et cetera, and today's money, as the kids say. I don't know that there's another era where until maybe today with these guaranteed tens of millions of dollars, because you can, draw from so many revenue streams. But wrestling, whereas the payroll and the salaries in other professional sports continued to increase at a steady rate, the top guys in the 30s were making a fortune. The top guys in the 50s were still making more money than most people. And the top guys in the 70s started getting left behind by the fucking baseball and football players. Somehow we didn't stay ahead of that curve.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing that interests me and I hope people get this from the book too, is that era. What I find interesting, to bring back Jack Curley a little bit, is that he and some of the other promoters of the day, I mean, they were building modern sports, kind of what you said. I mean, at the time that wrestling was getting going, professional baseball was just getting off the ground. Professional football was like barely even like a glint in the eye of people. College football was still kind of the main thing. Professional basketball was barely getting off the ground. So wrestling and boxing were like the big sports at the time in the late 1800s. And like, I love what you said. I mean, that sort of seat of your pants promotion, I mean, that was the model. You go out in a field and you build a gigantic wooden arena. Jack Curley was like at the forefront of that. He promotes the Jack Johnson fight. They're still banging down boards and trying to get the ring set up by the time the paying customers are coming in, So it was this incredible seat of your pants thing. But it's incredible to me how, by the era you're talking about, in the 1930s, and the Jim Londas and Madison Square Garden, and every major city has a gigantic arena, that happened so fast. I mean, that happened over the course of the 1920s, but he's really at kind of the forefront of it. And by the time wrestling comes back in the 1930s, they're like ready to take advantage of all that. And it's the most popular sport in the country. It's absolutely, to me, it's such a fascinating story, but I love like what we were saying, that seat of your pants kind of thing. And these guys kind of traveling over the country, and they were all around the country by car or by train, just trying to make the show on time. And I love that kind of freewheeling, like, sense of sports, because now sports are so organized and so, commercialized, but back then that just wasn't the case. And it's such a neat era to write about.
It's like looking at, a W.C. Fields movie, The Old Fashioned Way, where he's leading the wandering troupe of the the stage players of the drunkard, and he's trying to stay ahead of the sheriff and find, the investor to put on one show in one town so he can get the money to get to the next town. That's,
Totally.
and I think for the same reason that I love the history of Hollywood, from silence to the outbreak of sound, or the history of vaudeville or early radio. These people were performers in whatever genre that were figuring out what to do, in some case with a new medium or a new mode of expression, from scratch. And they had to just play it in front of people over and over. And then with wrestling, you compound that with the fact that it originated as an offshoot of the old Army game, wink, wink, nod, nod. It's a fucking con. It's a swerve. And you're banking on playing with people's emotions to get them emotionally invested in a conflict and on someone's side, and willing to fork out some kind of money, whether it's wagering on the outcome or just paying to see it. And it's just, to me, and you've got to be a performance artist and a monologuist and an incredible actor and a glib personality and an interesting person. And you got to do that 24 hours a day. That's not even a question.
No, it's not a question, but I will say you're taking the words right out of my mouth. I mean, I will say, I hope in the book, one thing I was able to accomplish, I hope, is not to make that era feel too antiquated, because to me, it felt very modern. And all of the stuff you're talking about, like I said, I think Jim Londos would have fit perfectly in 1980s WWF or NWA or whatever. Because, I mean, again, they were inventing this stuff in real time. And that's why I wanted to get that kind of word inventing in the title. Is it's like, I think Strangler Lewis, now they were building on what guys before them had done, for sure. But in the 1920s, you see him doing exactly what you said, getting these people emotionally invested in these matches. And then when the good guy loses, they're so angry, they're so upset, they like tear the arenas apart. They're like throwing chairs at him, and they're, I think Wladek Zabisco gets bashed over the head with a chair when he's trying to run from the ring in 1917 because people want to kill him so bad. I mean, this is not new. I mean, these guys, but they were making that up. You just don't see that really in other sports. But I think they had a sense, as like you said, is like, I really do think of them as performance artists. And
it was emotional more than obviously everybody hates when their favorite sports team wins, but they took it a step further. The people's favorite sports team was cheated. Maybe the referee didn't see it, but we saw it. God damn it. And this motherfucker. And they could engender that type of emotion, both positive or negative, that all the great bookers that followed through the 80s and 90s, were able to do the same thing, maybe not with as rudimentary a performance. But in those days, a little went a long way, and then we did shit too much. But that's exactly what your book brings that to life, is that these people, they knew psychology of the American public, much as a P.T. Barnum or as any Hollywood studio mogul. Louis B. Mayer knew what his American public was going to buy in the way of motion pictures. And they were able to give the baby face that out. Oh, he was cheated, if only so-and-so. And it was simple and it was believable, but the people would be, brought to a froth about it. And that necessitated a rematch. And then they began figuring out, well, we could do this, on a more widespread basis. And the programs and the territories and et cetera all sprang from, we want to get people interested in this fight, and how can we maximize the revenue involved in it?
I'll drop his name just because I love talking about him and I love him so much. But Steve Yohe, who a few people, hopefully more people will know his name, but probably in my mind, my favorite wrestling historian. I love him so much. But he can talk about this stuff for days. I mean, and he really goes into like, and this is where I was able to kind of learn from him. It's about the booking angles, and that you can see people think of booking angles that they were somehow invented by, I don't know, in the 1990s or something. They were booking angles in 1915, 1914, no doubt. I mean, there's the thing that kind of sparked my imagination so much is I think it was 1917, 1918. There was a match, Strangler Lewis and Jim Londos. And, Strangler Lewis, Billy Sandow, his manager, is driving people nuts because he's instructing Strangler Lewis from ringside. And, you can see he invents this idea of like the bad guy manager. That's there in 1917. But in this particular match, Jim Londos bends over to tie his shoe and Strangler Lewis rushes over and pins him unexpectedly. I mean, that absolutely was something they worked out before that match. I have no doubt in my mind that they did that as a performance to infuriate the fans. And it works perfectly. And all of this is in service of making sure there's a sellout next time they show up in town. And that just caught my imagination so much because that was what captured when I first got into wrestling in 1984. That was what I loved about it, is how it's like the best of movies, the best of sports, all that stuff all wrapped up into one.
When I first started going to the matches in the 70s, when I was a kid, I would say, because as we've talked about here on the program also, that Tennessee was a direct pipeline to the pioneer days because Roy Welch was still a major force in the early 70s. He had started wrestling in 1930 and had, he was the Southern Toots Mondt. And I would see these finishes where the heels would take the soap and rub it in the eyes of the babyface, or whatever the case, some type of cheap heel tactic that would bring people into a frenzy. And then our friend Scott Teal down in Nashville, it's done such, crowbarpress.com, folks, that's done such incredible research and did the book on Madison Square Garden is just incredible. But he'll do Knoxville, or he'll do Nashville, or he'll do Amarillo, Texas, and you will see in the newspaper accounts of these matches the same finishes I was seeing. If 40 years later, because they still worked, it made sense. The bad guy pulled out a foreign object, or he was, busted open the good guy with a bottle, or whatever the case. And, they just made up shit as they went that they thought would get people's interest involved. And you mentioned doing the newspaper research. When you go back to that era, you can see it raises questions because you can see these headlines like the riot that so and so caused, which are legitimate in most cases, but the police had to save the heel. But then also you see the police arrested the heel for disorderly conduct, for hitting the babyface over the head. And here's where you got to be a detective, right? Because both of these things have happened for real. It's happened that there was a local cop that was a friend of one of the guys that was smartened up even back then, and they would do an angle and put the heel in jail. And there was also cops that weren't smartened up that arrested the fucking heel for cheating in the wrestling match. And you have to do your detective work, right? To see, well, what was the time frame? And was there a pattern of this? And I'm sure you went through that a lot.
And I'll say too, to that point, I benefited so much. You mentioned Scott Teal. I mentioned CVO. We talked about Tim Hornbaker, but everybody, Greg Oliver, Steve Johnson. All the Mark Hewitt. I don't want to leave anybody out, but all of these incredible historians that have spent the past couple decades doing a lot of that detective work. So I really did benefit from that. You mentioned Scott's incredible Madison Square Garden. That was an incredible resource for me. Like Steve Yoe's book on Ed Lewis is an incredible resource for me. All of Tim's books. But to your point, right? You see not only the police, but doctors. There's a quote in Ed Lewis has an unpublished biography that I was able to kind of get some access to. And he talks about fooling doctors. And he has a quote in there where he says there's not an old-time wrestler alive who couldn't basically fool a doctor into thinking they had a wrenched back or a concussion and they needed to spend the night in the hospital so that they could get that in the newspapers the next day. And I wanted to make a point too to what we were talking about earlier is part of the thing in that era that I think they were able to infuriate the crowd so much was they had, because the crowd had come to love the babyface, right? But they had to do that by going there face to face, working the fans week after week after week, because they didn't have TV, they didn't have radio in the 1910s to get people to know who these characters were, so that when Ed Lewis cheated against, Jim Melendez or Joe Stecker or somebody, the fans were so emotionally invested in the good guy that they were infuriated that they lost. Like that was something that they had to really bang out and make these fans believe. And they just did it with just the sweat of their brow, traveling around doing this week after week in front of people. And I couldn't get enough of it when I was working on this. And I'll make a couple shouts too, because not only to the books and the newspapers and stuff, but the Notre Dame there's incredible resources around for people interested in this area. The Notre Dame has the Jack Feffer collection, which is unbelievable. And what you see when you go and you can look at that, like wrestling history comes just alive, because you actually have the letters from wrestlers writing to Jack Feffer saying, can you please book me, in the month of April? They write these crazy things. I have a mustache. I weigh 240 pounds. I go over great as a bad guy. So they're looking for work, and that's what this is. And it's just thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of these correspondence, which just bring the era so completely to life. It's absolutely unbelievable.
Well, and by the way, I don't know if I ever even want to go to Hawaii or whatever, but before I die, I got to go see the Jack Feffer collection. So I'm going to Notre Dame at some point, not to study. Well, I'm studying that, but you go back to the talking about the newspapers, and that's the Feffer collection is an example of stuff that was saved from inside the business, because when you're reading and researching newspapers, you're relying on what was reported, and in a business shrouded in secrecy, there wasn't a lot of inside paperwork, which makes Feffer all the more special because he saved everything because of the various issues he had going on with him. That someday we'll get one of you guys do a book just on Jack Feffer. But point being, so you had to separate some fact from some fiction in the newspapers and the various accounts. But at the same time, it does show you how they would get you mentioned the baby faces. They were so popular. Londos and being Greek, there's the brief glimpse or clips of him, in front of 100,000 people in his stadium in Greece, because he became a national hero there because of the way that he got over here. The people loved these heroes because they won more often than they lost. They always won cleanly. They were the all-American boys. And they took, evil, nasty cheaters to take them down, and people got behind that type. But as your book also chronicles, whenever the wrestling promoters would get too full of themselves and go for somebody who had more eye appeal than he had actual wrestling ability, that's when the double crosses came in. And there was a plethora of those during the latter years of your book. And that had to be fun to sit down and go through all the accounts and go, my God, I can't believe the time and effort. Months were sometimes put in these plots by wrestlers and their promoter to get a title match with a guy they wanted to fuck just so they could do it and get the belt back.
Yes. And I one of the kind of central questions that I think I was kind of interested in is, I think when I started this, I tried to really I really didn't know very much. I was kind of coming from a really naive place, but everything was kind of up for grabs as far as, in my mind, as far as like commonly accepted wrestling knowledge. Believe me, I spent so many email exchanges with so many wrestling historians. Was it possible that the whole, I don't want to go too deep for people who haven't read the book yet, but who may not know, but there's a pretty famous where Wayne Munn he's a famous example people write a lot about. He was orchestrated to effectively win the heavyweight title from Strangler Lewis. Munn had practically no practical experience with wrestling, but looked good. He was a big guy. People liked him. He goes on this incredible winning streak, and then Stanislaus Zbyszko, who was, a well-trained, well-known wrestler, kind of goes off script and humiliates him in Philadelphia and wins the world heavyweight title and throws everything into complete chaos. Is it possible that, what we accept the fact that Stanislaus did that, but is it possible that was a work? Was it somehow this just incredible double bluff, to even throw people off even more, like they were operating like in 3D chess or something like that. So thinking about, was it even possible that was somehow rigged? Stanislaus looking like he beat Wayne Munn to set up, an even bigger rematch. And this is where I was still kind of help working with people like Steve and stuff to think through it, is you get to see that we probably think that was legitimate because there was no rematch, right? Like if they ever been worse, like that's how you can tell. You can see through the booking what was real and what wasn't. Because,
in the words of Ernie Ladd, they gave Wayne Munn his comeback to the locker room.
That's exactly right. And that's right. And so you see it kind of with Dan O'Mahony too, when the most famous probably double crossing Dick Schickett takes the heavyweight title off Dan O'Mahony in Madison Square Garden. That had to be legitimate because Dick Schickett ends up going to work for another promoter and he takes the heavyweight title, effectively like what Ric Flair did, right? When, you show up on somebody else's promotion with the heavyweight championship, like that's a clear sign that's pretty legitimate, and then they end up in court and they're fighting it out. So, but it's incredible. And those double crosses, to me, there's this incredible picture. And I was lucky enough to get a copy of it to put in the book of Dick Schickett putting Dan O'Mahony in this armbar, right? And that's effectively the move that he uses to make poor Dano submit in front of Madison Square Garden. But you think of it from Dano's perspective here, he's not expecting this, and somehow this guy is threatening to break his arm, pull his arm out of the socket in front of 8,000 people and humiliates him. And that just felt so real to me, that the pain he must have been going through, how horrible that must have felt to have to happen to him in front of all these people. He lays in the ring for like 5 minutes because he can't move after he's been, so beaten up by Dick Schickett. And that kind of stuff, it just doesn't happen anymore. And it's, thank God it doesn't happen anymore, maybe, but it was so interesting to me to put myself in these guys' shoes and try to imagine what they were thinking and feeling.
Well, see, the thing is, in those days, as we mentioned, most everybody had to have, or better have, some legitimate ability in the ring when the going gets tough. But the double crosses were for major money, for major titles, right? To jockey leverage from one of the top wrestlers and promoters to the other, or back to the trust, or whatever it may be. And there was a lot on the line in those matches. And then by the 50s and 60s, if somebody got in a shoot or stretched somebody just because they were pissed at each other in the fucking ring, because there wasn't that, they couldn't capitalize anymore. The promoters had taken more tighter control of things by that point. But it looks like to me, when you go back and look at this era, and especially the 30s, that the promoters and the wrestlers in the 40s, 50s, and 60s either were around or still remembered the 30s and the 70s, even to some extent. They were always chasing not only that level of popularity again, but they were also always staying away from the things that happened during that period of time that caused problems in the business, whether it be exposés or whether it be double crosses. And you might not have heard this story. Brian knows it, but I'll bore him constantly anyway. When Chris Candido, in, 1994, won the NWA world title, such as it was, on a Dennis Corluzzo show, he was flying back because he was in Knoxville working for me regularly. He's flying back and he meets in the airport bathroom, he sees Lou Thez. Right? Lou Thez, first match in 1935. It's 1994. He was the personal protege of Strangler Lewis.
I can't wait to hear where this is going.
Well, but Chris is the biggest wrestling fan in the world, and he's about to. They're at the urinal side by side, and he's about to shit himself at the urinal because he sees it Lou Thez. And he goes up after they dried their hands, and as humbly as he can said, "Mr. Thez, oh yes, son, Mr. Thez." And he can see the blonde hair. Thez can, right? So, and Chris was even though he was short, he was a thick kid. "Mr. Thez, I'm a wrestler. Chris Candido, it's such an honor to meet you." And of course, Lou is very friendly. And then Chris says, You may find this hard to believe, but I just won the NWA world title in a match at wherever it was in Cherry Hill or wherever. And Thesz says, he says, well, just remember, son, as you go around to these different territories, watch out. Somebody's going to want to try to double cross you. It was 1994 at this, but
Yep.
it was still ingrained in Thesz. Watch out for the double cross. You got to be able to take care of yourself. 60 years later.
No, and I completely agree with you. I mean, we were talking about the Feffer collection. I think what makes that so unique, if I could, I spent a little bit of time trying to figure out what made Jack Feffer tick, but he was so afraid, I think, of being double crossed. I think that's why he held on to all that stuff. I think he had felt so burned by promoters, he held on to all those documents so that should he ever need to create a paper trail of something, right, that he had something to hold over their heads. But what the promoters, all the other promoters, but the point there is that they didn't hold on to any documents. They didn't want a paper trail. And I think the promoters, like you said, Roy Welch, all those guys who came out of that era, Roy Shire, all these guys that came out of that era, they knew the shorter the paper trail, the less that they could be pinned on them, right? And I think there's this incredible quote I found from, and this was in one of the, believe it or not, one of the letters in the Feffer collection. Al Haff, who was the promoter in Cleveland, wrote a letter to Jack Feffer in, I want to say 1937, when they were working together. And he says, effectively, don't put over anybody you can't control because they're going to make your life hell. And like that just feels like, that to me is like that's like the core kind of, the like day one for like what would become a professional wrestling from then on. It was guys you could control, guys that would kind of work according to what the promoters wanted them to do. And that's what drove the business. And not to diminish any of those guys. I mean, because they were all amazing, but that it was that the promoters really controlled the business from then on.
Well, and when you were at the Feffer collection, I know it's mammoth. Did you see I don't know if it's a card or an envelope or whatever, the note about Christine Jarrett? Have you heard about this? Have you read about this?
I feel like I've heard about it, but please tell me again, because I know that something happened between them.
Well,
I've always wanted to
there
hear
is
more about it.
There is one note that I've seen a reproduction of that he jotted down on the back of an envelope or something or other, Feffer, saying, "This is the night that Christine Jarrett threatened, Treaten, to kill me." It was almost over for Jack, and it was sometime in the 60s, and he was pulling the deal where if he was, I think he might have been managing the girls, or maybe I'm conflating this with the story in Texas where the kind of same thing happened, but he'd go in with his girls and want the promoter to book him, or go in with whoever and want the promoter to book him so he'd get his cut. And most of the time, just to not have trouble with Jack Feffer, they just do it. But he came in, and Nick and Roy didn't want to play ball. And, Feffer said that was his standard thing. Well, I'll go to the newspaper. And Christine, I don't know, I'm sure she didn't use any profanity, but in some way she expressed upon him that if he tried to go expose their business, that they would kill him.
Well, Feffer, I think someone actually is working on a book about him, but I mean, you can see there's a couple of things. I think this may be an apocryphal story, but he gets dangled out of a window by one person. Not sure if that one's true. Maurice Tillet punched him out for sure in a locker room. So, and there's a story too that shows up. I want to say it's in maybe Life magazine. He got interviewed, but he gets punched out in a restaurant too by a wrestler. And I want to say 1938. So I think he was, a lot of people wanted to kill him. I think pretty early on, a lot of people wanted to kill him.
Well, and I think that's because Rip Rogers used to hear the story that Bruiser took over Indiana by dangling somebody out a window. But I think that comes from because I think Feffer really did get dangled out of a window. And then it became apocryphal for every promoter that a guy was mad at.
But I'll say too, and this is a conversation we were talking about, I think the beauty of that era, although this is a terrible story, but the beauty of that era, I think, is that it's, again, so hard to know what's real. And this is an extreme example of that. But this was a conversation we had actually had over email as I was working on the book. Was so to catch everybody up on the story. So again, Dick Schickett double crosses Dan O'Mahony. promoters effectively try to kind of buy him off to get the belt back. He won't do it. He goes to work for another promotion. So they sue him for breach of contract. It ends up in federal court in Columbus, Ohio, and in a court case that makes all kind of national headlines. During that period, Dick Schick at one point gets a break from the trial. He goes to wrestle a match in Detroit where he drops the heavyweight title. His wife is actually killed in a car accident during that trip. She dies, and she stays behind in Columbus and dies. There is like a theory floating around that the wrestling promoters somehow have gotten together and, cut her brakes and she dies in this car accident where they're capable of something like that, which of course, to me, I think it's one of these things where kind of like the truth is stranger than fiction. It was just this terrible coincidence that happened, that she happened to die during this trip, but that people still, that's the kind of level of what they were operating on. I think that people think they were even capable of doing something like that. That's how serious the business was back then. Of course, I think they had nothing to do with it. I think it's impossible that they did that. But I think that's the kind of strange blending of fact and fiction in that era. It is so completely embodies that blending of fact and fiction. It's just endlessly interesting to me.
That's the point that I've made for a long time, and some people still don't pick up on it, is that you can suspect, or you can think, or or as long as the other person or entity doesn't come out and tell you, yeah, you're fucking right, then there's always that mystery. And that's what creates the doubt and the suspension of disbelief. And that's where we went wrong. And these people went to extraordinary and sometimes superhuman lengths to not let everybody know what the fuck was going on, but encourage them to think anything they wanted as long as they showed up. And go ahead.
No, I was just gonna. I don't want to take us off topic here, but I mean, this just happened to me because we had one of the events we did to kind of promote the book locally was we showed Andy Kaufman's "I'm from Hollywood," which is a documentary that Lynn Margulies, who was his girlfriend at the time, directed it, made a documentary of Andy's career in wrestling. And I'm sure most people probably know all about his career. But what struck me is, I loved Andy, that whole era. I've seen the movie a dozen times, but sitting in a movie theater where we were able to show it at a local theater here, we had a great crowd of people that came out. Watching it through the eyes of people that didn't know anything about Andy Kaufman's wrestling career, it brought all of that back to me of just like, you really can't tell. Like, this guy's getting in there. Jerry Lawler drops him on his head a couple times. You can't spot where the fiction is in there. And Andy Kaufman's in the hospital. He's in traction. He's wearing this neck brace on national TV for months at a time. And Lynn is the woman that directed the movie, said to me once, she's like, he would probably rather have died than ever admit that any of that was fake. And I mean, that's the level that they went to.
And, and he grew up as a kid watching Buddy Rogers on television, pointing to his head, I'm the smartest one. But I've told this story, but my cousin Larry's wife was a nurse at the time in Memphis at the hospital that they took Andy to. And I was the, the young photographer in those days. I wasn't even a manager yet. So when I was down there, I'd stay at their house for free. And, I come back from the matches and she comes home from the night shift and said, hey, they brought Andy Kaufman in. He's really hurt. It made it, I'm there, but it made her kind of think there's something to the wrestling. It's dangerous. When I got involved in it, they're like, oh shit, because they didn't know. And you mentioned that the old timers knew how to pass a medical examination for various things. That's what neck injury. I don't know about now with modern technology and these,
right,
scanning machines, but in those days, even in the 80s, you got this symptom in your neck and you heard that, you felt that. We can't tell. That's what it built the personal injury lawsuit fucking industry.
Before the days of X-rays, right? It was a lot easier. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, right. And I mean, Gus Sonnenberg spends the night in the hospital after a match with Ed Lewis. He gets driven in an ambulance, and he spends the weekend in the hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. I mean, and that's all over the newspapers. People were writing about
tricks. The little tricks spread to Ronnie West, the referee for Georgia wrestling for so many years, was a great guy, huge fan, helped promote shows, blah, blah, blah. But if they did a deal in the Chattanooga Memorial Auditorium on a Saturday night where one of the heels cracked him over the head with a boot or something and he got juice, he would make sure it was a nice one and get stitches on purpose, 8 or 10. And then over the next few days, he would go around downtown Chattanooga and going into restaurants or bars or businesses with this big gash. Well, what happened to you? Oh, that damn interns last Saturday night. That's grassroots promotion. The referee's actually going in and saying, please come see Saturday night to see if I can get even with them because I'm going to be in the corner of so-and-so or whatever, right? Or just to make the business look real. Yeah, they bashed my head open. Oh, shit.
I've again, I think what got me so interested in doing this is, and you mentioned this earlier too, is that there's no line. When you're a professional wrestler in that era, there was no line. Like when you left the arena, if you're in the bar, if you're in the supermarket, if you're wherever, you're that guy. You have to be that guy. Because as soon as you get up to people and say, oh, no, it's all bullshit, that's just an act. I mean, that's the end of it back then. So they had to live, I'm sure you can tell me way more than this, but I've heard stories where it's like, wrestlers basically, in some respects, swerved their families, where it was just like they didn't really even talk about whether it was fake when they went home.
Oh, and no,
so
yes.
I hate to use the word fake. I've said that a couple of times. I don't mean to use that word.
It's a word.
Just throw that word around.
But you sometimes you wouldn't smarten up your wife in the old days. And I mean, when I got into business, there was still some people who would, follow that. This is only 40 years ago. You didn't smarten the kids up sometimes at all, or sometimes until they were a certain age where you could count on them not to go bragging they knew more than the other kids at school, right? And if they were properly indignant when somebody called their dad fake, then that was even better. And kids aren't good actors. So, but Jesse Barr, Sandy Barr's son, Art Barr's brother, when I managed him when I first got started in Memphis, he invited me over to his apartment for lunch after we came back to Nashville from Memphis TV. And he said, now I haven't smartened my wife up yet. So, okay. Well, he was ribbing me and he had smartened her up, but I was working with him because, it wasn't that fucking odd. Right. And, you had to be careful. Well, now anybody with a goddamn internet, they're not going to get married to anybody before they're smart to the wrestling business. But that was, again, you had to blur the lines. There were instances where Terry Funk's told the story. When he was a kid, guy in Amarillo came up to Dory Sr. in a restaurant. A bunch of bullshit. And Dory Sr. just beat the ever-loving shit out of that guy right in that restaurant. Had to protect the business. Dory Funk Sr. is the toughest guy in Texas. But then guys would do angles where they would agree to go to a public place and create some kind of disturbance and get arrested on purpose. But and you've read the Bruiser and Alex Karras thing in Detroit. Probably Bruiser decided on his own and got out of hand. And Karras was probably not apprised of what exactly was going to go on, and that made the fucking papers. But it's a blur of all of the realities. Some, partially, none.
Complete. I'll say two quick things. Is like, you see that in 1929, Gus Sonnenberg. Gus Sonnenberg's probably my all-time favorite. I mean, he was I don't know if we mentioned this, but he was a football player turned professional wrestler in the end of the 1920s. But he's the biggest name in wrestling for a period of time, and he's walking around Los Angeles downtown, gets approached by a guy who wants to kind of challenge him to a match. And in broad daylight, in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of Los Angeles, right, in the middle of Hollywood, this guy headbutts him on the street. Gus falls to the ground, knocked unconscious. Police have to come. The guy gets arrested, right, and that makes national headlines. All the other promoters who are trying to kind of take him down, it's just like, how does this heavyweight champion get taken out by a regular guy on the street? I mean, he was humiliated by that, and so
they put the belt on a worker and who got caught by surprise. And then that was the instigation for Lewis and company deciding, well, we need to take control of this thing. And that was the next double cross pretty soon, correct?
Exactly. So there from the title goes from there to, they put it on Ed. Oh God, now I'm going to blank on his name, but a legitimate wrestler.
Ed Don George.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Ed Don George. And so it goes to a legitimate worker at that point. But all of that stuff served to kind of hurt Gus Sonnenberg's reputation, where he was just the biggest wrestler in the world for a period of time, and you see his popularity kind of trail off because of a couple different controversies. But I mean, that era, and this is again why.
And now Lewis had a chapped ass about that, because when he, for business reasons, put the belt on Sonnenberg, he was supposed to be the one to get it back, and then they put it on Ed Don George, who had wrestled in the Olympics. But that didn't make a shit to Lewis, and it took him a little while to get back in the picture.
And then you see now, and this is a whole rabbit hole. I mean, if somebody hasn't written a book on this, somebody probably could. There's a match in Montreal that happens around that time where they say Lewis bit the heavyweight champion, and Lewis gets disqualified with Henri de Glane for a match up in Montreal, and there's all this controversy around this match, and was it a work, and I mean, there are so many examples in that era where the line, like we just keep saying, is so completely blurred between reality and fiction. It's just incredible. But that era, to me, and this is why I wanted to write the book so bad, again, I think to me it's I don't know if it's fair to say it's uniquely American, but I think it's a fairly uniquely American invention, professional wrestling. And I just feel like that book hadn't been written yet. Of like, where did this thing come from? Like, how did this all get started? How did it get off the ground? And I think this is the era where it all happened. And again, I think all of the conventions that we made us all love wrestling, no matter really what era you came to it in, I think they were all created back then. And all these guys just were creating it, like you said, in real time, from whole cloth, basically, just figuring out what works from day to day. Some by happenstance, some through just kind of the sweat of their imagination, as they used to say, like figuring out what's going to sell tickets and what's going to keep people interested in this thing. And it's just incredible. Again, like the stuff they set in motion, to see how it's just grown and evolved here in some ways more popular than ever. It's incredible.
And, I just realized I've dominated this thing. Brian, are you still with us?
I'm still with you. I'm listening. This is great.
Do you have, because I know you love the book as much as I do, which is, again, an hour after we said it originally, Ballyhoo, the Roughhousers, Con Artists, and Wild Men Who Invented Professional Wrestling by Jon Langmead, who you've been hearing speak. Brian, what do you got? You got to ask John something.
Well, I just think it's an incredible feat to put all these stories together. I own the master copy of the Ed Strangler Lewis manuscript that you referenced before. And,
yes,
I have that. I have the Fall Guys. I have the annotated Fall Guys. I have Steve Yohe's Strangler Lewis book. There are all these different books, whether you're talking about Fall Guys, which, the veracity of it at times has been questioned, which is why you have the annotated version. And we think a lot of it came from Toots Mondt. The Strangler Lewis story is his story in his own words. You had to find a way to kind of take all of these elements and then incorporate the people that didn't say anything and didn't write down anything. And then these newspaper reports, which are all over the place. How tough was it for you to feel comfortable each chapter that you got what was right, and what was wrong?
That's a good question. I think I will again give credit to, all of the big historians, Steve Yohe and Johnson and Greg and a lot. They let me bounce so much information off them, and and Tim and everybody. They were without fail. These guys are the nicest guys, and they were so willing to share information and eager to talk. And it's just they're just an incredible resource, and I wish they got more attention. So that they were a humongous help. I mean, I could bounce questions off them where I felt unsure about something, or I could they would help me sort of check myself if I wasn't, really confident in anything. I think anytime you're playing around in this era, you're running a lot of risks. I will say that the one thing I was really, really I didn't want to do was perpetuate any myths. So I'll give it like a quick example of that is something like, the term the Gold Dust Trio gets thrown around a lot. And I remember it drives poor Steve Yohe crazy because he's like, no, that was a term that was invented during Fall Guys. They didn't really call them that. Like, you don't see newspapers where they mention the Gold Dust Trio, for example, before that's a term used in Fall Guys. And now we just use it. But it was probably Tutzman who coined that term for himself. Like, he was probably rewriting wrestling history in some ways with that term. But so I didn't want to use that, or even the word like kayfabe, which I didn't want to use it because that wasn't how the wrestlers spoke about themselves in that era. And so I was really trying to be sensitive to that. Like you said, I tried to just, if I felt like something I couldn't totally validate it, I tried to leave it out because I just didn't want to take that chance of moving. And I'm sure I made some mistakes. I'm sure people will correct the record on me, and I'm totally open to that. And then the last thing I'll say too is, because Jim mentioned this briefly in the beginning, is I struggled with a lot with what to include and what not to include. So that's why the notes section is so long. And I hope people do read the notes, is because stuff I felt would disrupt the story potentially, or that wasn't completely like right on point with the main narrative, I moved to the notes section. And there's, I hope, a lot of really useful information in that section too. It didn't quite fit the story. I was worried I would lose people along the way, but I didn't want that stuff to get lost either.
Jack Curley's kind of the mantra of the book. You always return to him no matter what else is happening in different parts of the country with all these different characters. You began the book, without playing spoiler, with an interesting chapter that illustrates Jack Curley's influence and power in New York and on Long Island. It's the Huey Kingfish Long chapter that you began the book with. It was an interesting decision to start the book with that. What caused you to do it?
Well, when I came across that story in the first place, I felt like, and for people to give people some quick background who haven't read the book. So Huey Long, who was the senator from New York, pretty powerful figure, pretty controversial figure, was at a kind of society dinner in Great Neck, Long Island, which was, this incredibly moneyed part of New York, full of, entertainers and Broadway performers and great, the Great Gatsby is set there. Fitzgerald lived there for a long time. Anyway, he's at this high society party, which kind of inherently conflicts with his sort of image of this great populist and very, the great working man's representative. So anyway, he's at this party and has too much to drink and gets into an altercation in the bathroom. And Jack Curley, the wrestling promoter, in fact, helps him, kind of smuggles him out of the party, and they try to keep his name out of the papers, and they try to kind of let this thing go without too much press, which of course doesn't happen, and it ends up in a million newspapers. But when I first came across this story, I thought there's no way this could be the same Jack Curley. And of course it turned out to be. I mean, it's just another example of him just showing up all these incredible times in history. But so I felt like, for me, this was, without getting too kind of far down in the woods here, like, there's a certain element, I think, of cynicism that can set in sometimes with people, where it's just like, well, wrestling's a fake, everything's a fake, sports are fake, everything's rigged, this is rigged, that's rigged. And I really fight hard against that kind of belief. Like, I don't believe it. I don't buy it. And I'm not trying to talk politics or whatever, but I felt like that story was sort of this really cool, again, the truth being stranger than fiction. You couldn't write that, right? Like, what are the odds here? This Huey Long guy, ends up in New York, gets attacked in the bathroom, tries to cover it up, tells a million different stories about what happened, none of which anybody buys. They end up seeing the truth, and the truth, which I won't spoil for people, is so pathetic and pitiful about what really happened to him in the bathroom. It's just like, that's his perfect example, where it's like, you can fool people some of the times, you can't fool all the people all the time, kind of thing. And it's just like, somehow that blend of wrestling and politics was kind of too irresistible for me to leave out.
John, this book is something that Jim and I have had many conversations off air about. Even before we started talking on air about it, we loved it. And I had the same reaction that Jim had. I was upset when it ended. I was upset when there was no more. Even though the notes are great, I wanted more of the book. It was great. What are you working on next? What are you thinking about working on next? And do you plan to dive more into wrestling's history, specifically pre-World War II, in the future?
Well, right now I'm working on music. I play in a couple different bands that are keeping me kind of busy right this second. So I will quickly put plugs in for those real quick, but I play with a band called the Paranoid Style, if anybody's heard of them. We just have a record that just came out on Bar None, and I play in a band called Choo Choo Le Rouge that people can check out. We have a record coming out on Kayam Records. As far as that's keeping me pretty busy right this second. But as far as the wrestling goes, I had kind of sworn off. I wasn't going to really write any more about wrestling. I sort of just wanted to focus on some other things. But I'm starting to get ideas of. I'd love to do something on the 1980s. It's the era that I grew up watching. It's the era I kind of grew up loving, and the characters that I grew up loving. And there's just something there, I feel like, and I've been thinking a lot of whether it could make a book, but that's what I'm starting to think starting to think more about. Because again, that era, that's when I think again the truth and fiction got blended just so incredibly. And again, an era where the promoters were basically fighting to the death, in that era. And I kind of like, again, what you saw in the 1930s, where they were basically fighting each other to the like a bloody end, basically.
Back to you, Jim.
Oh, hey, no, I just, we've done everything but tell the people how they can get this book. Ballyhoo, the Roughhousers, Con Artists, and Wild Men Who Invented Professional Wrestling by Jon Langmead. John, do they go to Amazon? Are we in Barnes & Noble? They got to go to the corner gas station? What's going on? How can we get this book?
And by the way, we will have an Amazon link on Twitter for the listeners. Let me just throw that in here.
Thanks. No, so hopefully all of those things. Hopefully the corner gas station is carrying it. Hopefully Barnes & Noble is carrying it. But anywhere you get books, you can get it. Amazon definitely is carrying it. Put a plug in for bookshop.org and some of the independent retailers too that you can definitely get it from. But anywhere you get books, you should be able to get a copy of it. It's out on University of Missouri, greatest publication, greatest press in the world. And please check it out. And I just can't thank everybody enough that's bought a copy and read about it or written about it. And it means the world to me that people have so far it seemed to be enjoying it and getting something out of it. So I can't say thanks to everybody enough.
John, thank you for being part of the program, and we hope that everybody gets a copy of this, especially all the people in the wrestling business today. You can learn how it's supposed to be done directly from the experts, through John, of course. Anyway, we're going back to our regularly scheduled bullshit.